Today, in everyone's favorite topic rubric, we're going to apply our mathematical understanding to predict the 2028 election, albeit this methodology, these principles may apply to almost any election. Because, in summary, there is a very limited scope in terms of necessary variables to a political election. There are just not that many things that are meaningful. The two sides of an election are the candidate side and the polity side. On the polity side, we look at the data, and I have done on this channel historically over mostly demographics. What and who you are determines how you vote. And this can come into economics, but usually socio-economic principles, and that's how poor or rich you are, skin color, height, testosterone levels, handsomeness, all of these things culminate into you, the individual, very special. Ego, who determines their decision to vote in a certain way. This is the flaw with democracy, is it's insanely predictable. We've seen the predictability at levels now harnessed in British elections by Dominic Cummings and his team there, his analytics team, but then also with Peter Thiel's team in America. And it's very clear that the progress of statistical application, particularly with the advent and prodigious rise of adoption of AI, will allow for the honing in on the very small minutiae on determined subjects. So, which is a very funky and complex way of just saying that the ability for us to determine the next president is based on the polity side, very easily understood. Are you white, middle class, male, age between 25 and 35, then I can predict what you'll vote like, etc., etc. But on the candidate side, it is much more difficult to propose in advance this type of candidate that we feel as if will be a reflection of the principles that we've just outlined on the polity side, which is difficult because you want someone who will win, first and foremostly. But the powers at play internally for a political party like the Democrats or the Republicans in America, but it can go for any party in any country, is that there are a lot of brokers in terms of power that have their own interests, which are exclusive oftentimes at the thought of winning. And you can see this with the Democratic Party at current stage, and its inability to coalesce behind a leader because it doesn't have anyone. And anyone who's suggested has a flaw so detrimental to the total juggernaut of victory that they're incapable of being promoted by the entire party and thus are seen as abject and rejected for that instance. So for someone like Kamala, she's clearly defunct. She's just a retard. Then you have someone like Pete Buttigieg, who's just a flamboyant homosexual and will never get elected. Then you have Joe Biden's corpse, which they can't roll out again, unfortunately for them. And then there's Gavin Newsom, who is the smarmy Californian, which will be very difficult to pull through on the Midwest and Eastern seaboards. So you have to see that there's a dearth of good candidates for the Democrats because of its inability to back in a monolithic fashion a single candidate with a unifying principle behind themselves. You can't, in that party, be a white male anymore because they've determined, and this is the factional determination internally, that that's not sufficient to represent them. They've got to the very clear and salient point that democracy is a representation of you. You need to have, if you're a brown-faced lesbian woman, you want a brown-faced lesbian woman as your candidate. So Kamala would be your pick. No, she's not a lesbian. She's also, I don't think she's, well, maybe, but she's opportunistically sexual, so maybe she swings that way. But that's how the voting instinct goes, and that's why the matching between the polity and the candidate is so important. And so Donald Trump represented quite a vast swathe of Americana, as it was traditionally known in the 70s and 80s, is Donald Trump's very outspoken, brash, braggadocio manner. It isn't necessarily Midwestern or Southern or Texan, but it is very American, and that's enough because there's still enough Americans left to win the popular vote that way and swing states, etc. The way that we can then understand his protege JD Vance, is a little bit more difficult because JD is not quite as charismatic. Now, he's chud-tastic, which great, we love the chud, but unfortunately for him and many others, that's not quite the universal appeal of someone like Donald, even though Donald is very polarizing. He's polarizing positively in that once you've taken a stance for or against him, you continue to maintain that level because you see him as the earnest and honest choice. Say like, I know Donald, I won't switch now because everyone else is on offer. Donald would have a much more difficult time contesting, I would say a primary, but maybe the total election against someone like Kennedy, for instance, where if there's someone as charming, then Donald might come across as less alpha, more of a sourpuss and a bit catty, for instance, which may be unappealing to many of those types. So in a contest of like alpha males, then Donald would actually be challenged. And that would have been what I would have done if I was the Democratic Party. You put against the big dog, a similar big dog, because odds on that if you can still win the natural Latino and brown vote, basically, and the proportion of educated female vote, things like this, then you'll try and just win the swing vote, which is going to be white, usually men. And they didn't do that. Joe Biden won off the back of questionable ethics, but it was very similar in that manner. I was like, we think Joe is at least reflective of some of these things. And you can see here in the list of previous candidates that charisma is part and parcel and basically corollary to you being a good candidate, or you could say charisma maybe is the presupposition, and that being a good candidate is corollary to that. You can see this from the losers much as you can see it from the winners. So George Bush was decently charismatic, Southern Texan, versus Al Gore, who was painful and just quite a bit spiteful and smarmy. But Bill Clinton, obviously much more preferable to someone like Bob Dole or George Bush, who was just annoying, really, and not so similar to his son. John McCain, Mitt Romney, both of whom are very milquetoast, apathetic picks. And even Mike Pence, it was very clear, I think, for Donald that he was not going to sway voters a third time, and that him as a running mate was offering nothing to him, not even as a presumptive nominee, say, for the 2028 election, because Mike is anathema to, well, women, everyone basically, except a very small segment of evangelical Christians. Now, for us on the other side, Joe Biden did have charisma when he was younger. I don't necessarily think I align a lot of his political principles, but you can see why people would have voted for him. And he was a senator in Delaware since he was like 31 or something crazy. And Barack Obama had a manufactured artifice of charisma. It's the newscaster charisma. How do you appear to be charming without actually being charming? And so it's very easy to see how you beat someone like John McCain, who's just a stuffy octogenarian or at that point, but some sort of old, haggard, hoary man. So it's very clear here. Hopefully that paints a very vivid, evidenced picture of why the idea of charisma matters so much on the candidate side, and that going forward, it's going to be very easy to determine the winners and losers particularly in American elections. But once again, this could go for any nation state that holds the farce of democracy at the forefront of their principle of governance. So to learn this lesson, it's very, or at least maybe to reflect on this lesson and then put it into practice. Let's say the praxis of this video in the diatribe that I'm giving you here on this topic and the subject is that we can determine the winner and the loser. Now, game theory is fairly useless from a theoretical standpoint when it's tried to be applied. Applied game theory is very niche and I would say not that useful in politics, except when we can propose a very succinct version of a game, and this is a one-off game where we say what would be Party A's choice and Party B we can think of as the candidate, Party A as the polity. We know that they're going to support, oppose, we don't worry about this third line on a saddle point here, but we know that there's going to be an optimal choice here for the most of the populace of a polity choosing a candidate which has reflections on them. Reflections we can build out. If you're familiar with an RPG, that you know what a characteristic stat sheet is. It basically determines your build of your character. And it's a very reductive way of doing it. But I like the thematic understanding of it, the heuristics behind it. Why do we consider charisma, intelligence, willpower, strength, all of these things to be certain and very distinct categories, typologies of how and who you are? It's because we can reflect them in, if not very quantitatively, qualitatively enough that we can give it I would say a cardinal, but it can be counted as some sort of determinant factor. We can say there's a coefficient around strength, there's a coefficient around charisma, around willpower, around intelligence, and dexterity maybe. But the idea really being that we have an idea of who you are, and we can put it onto a sheet, and everyone generally reflects on that and says, yes, that's probably true. Like if we put Donald Trump as a RPG character, and we said, what is Donald's willpower? We'd say it was quite high. Someone who's been that determined through business, through multiple bankruptcies, highs, lows, all through business career, and then a political career all the way into his 80s, must have an extremely strong willpower. It's just non-negotiable in terms of determinant. So you say whatever the ranking is out of 100, it would be like something like 95. There probably are people with more willpower, but the culmination of a good political candidate is not built out of one. It's not a spider graph with a very pointed and an imbalanced variable. It's very much more balanced. At least it coalesces around a certain type of individual. And this is similar to the Big Five personality, but you need the schematics to match good political candidate to what we consider the characteristics. And this goes into your physical determinations as well. You need to be the reflection of your populace. Even as a Caesar, you have to be someone who looks like the rest of the male warrior age class. It can work similarly to females, but then you need to reflect on men something that they desire and or would sympathize with. So you can be very attractive or something, but then that also detracts. So you need to be stern and stoic, a little bit motherly without being too haggish, Harridan, nagging that level, but much more like authoritative as a woman. It's very difficult for the woman to be able to straddle that point. But in general, I think that's the idea that we have. Mostly men reflecting the warrior class that they're in, with seniority or experience being one of the key, albeit not exclusive, determinants for good candidacy. So once we've built our character sheet, we've determined what you as a political candidate look like, and I've sat you down. Then we look at, this is computation, combinatorics, so we can look at the permutations of the certain variables to each other. We say, look, I can determine on the polity side, this type of voter represents most of the voting populace and the ones that we will win in these segments. It's very clear to me that that's the case. We can optimize some of these things in a way that allows you to win more, ideally, votes with something like policy measures, but much more around probably catechisms and propaganda. Catechisms, which are downstream of propaganda, propaganda being the ability to deliver not even a salient message, but at least, if not an ephemeral and nebulous one, a very distinct, if not graspable message on my platform. What am I representing in my core thesis here? What's my anima as a candidate? And how do you come across at understanding it? Can I convey to you all of my embodied principles in a way that feels very catchy and meaningful? If I stand there on a horseback with my shirt off, a la Benito Mussolini, what was that going to do to the people who will vote for me, want to be represented by me? Will they like that machismo and that grandiose nature of politics as some sort of, I want to call it monarchical, but also emperor-style governance? Will you want to see that versus some very low-level civil servant sniveling around, which is very akin to German politics, where the current German politics, obviously I should say, in their liberal democratic stage, which is a German civil servant who's just puffing around what would be any bureau with no sense of decorum or power or anything that's attractive in that way, because Germans aren't allowed to have charismatic politicians after having the most charismatic. They basically went invert, and then they have had this generational reaction, or you could call it a reflux to that. It's no longer stomachable for them to have a charismatic candidate because they know if they have one, it'll be the best kind. So they can't do it anymore. So that's how we can understand the combinatorics of this. How you are represented is determined by the variables that you're bringing to the table, and how the representative on the other side of those things can be done. So we can see the cross-sectional, once again, permutation of all these inputs into probability circles. So it's likely if I'm representing the Netherlands as a candidate, then I would have to speak on these 5 important topics in a way that's very distinct as a platform. It doesn't necessarily have to be very core legislative principles, but it has to be something like, I'm going to deport all the Moroccans. I'm going to have a fairly advantageous tax scheme for farmers. I'm going to maintain a certain level of social programs for the aged populace, and you can see how you can start to platform yourself as a very likely candidate pursuing certain goals politically, and that if you can reflect the necessary votes, then obviously you'll be Prime Minister. This is, once again, one thread of the rope here, which you need to, or the twine, which you need to roll in together, because it's not possible to do this by being a completely charisma vacuum, like you have seen, because a current leader who is a charisma vacuum like Keir Starmer has a disgustingly low approval rating about 1 month into the job. Power now and age requires you to have distinct popularity across time. It can't be, you can obviously get elected once, that's fine, but it is much more important and valid for you to be able to be popular across your period of governance, because it allows you to push through certain legislation and transform the political office into a representation of you rather than necessarily of a external exogenous position. It's like, I'm not just Prime Minister, I'm the Liberator as the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister's office now represents me rather than the vice versa. You can see that with Trump. Trump is the president. It's not President Trump, it's Trump the president, if that makes sense. And so he defines the office almost as much as the office defines him. It was not the case for historically presidents, except someone like FDR, for instance, or going before that, someone like Lincoln, who was defined by themselves rather than the presidential office. If you can remember their name, they're probably, and they're not just recent, so it's not just memory, but it's like historically relevant and important, then they've transcended the office. And then that way you can understand that the charisma and the power is something that you want to grasp holistically. It's not just the, like I said, one-off George Bush Sr. winning an election in 1992 and gone 4 years later, because no one remembers shit about his time in office. He didn't do anything. He was worthless. And he may as well not have been elected. Maybe for his own ego, he felt good about being president once, but who gives a shit? Like, historically irrelevant, it may as well be me. Like, he and me in 100 years, 200 years are going to be remembered exactly the same. I can guarantee you that. And if you think that's not true, try and remember any Caesars. Or try and remember any leaders from any countries past 100, 150 years. You'll only remember off the top of your head, unless you're a historical scholar, the important ones. Because that's, as humans, what we do. We relate the most important things to how we have the prism of the world in our minds. Now, how we've gone about doing this is, once again, the hopefully triangulation, or you're starting to pick the thread here of what I'm trying to outlay to you, in that combinatorics is very useful because you can start to create a probability space whereby we've defined what interactions are required to generate what probabilities around harnessing power. I need someone who's charismatic, who has what it takes to push through difficulties, tribulations, and is whimsical enough to be enjoyed as a guest, as a host, as someone who's convivial and congenial in those ways, both private and public. So there are a lot of elements to this that aren't just very high IQ, very smart, very determined. These aren't sufficient. You can just go and be a businessman for that, but to be a hold high political office in perpetuity in some sort of substantive case requires a certain type of man. That man must be these things. It isn't possible otherwise. And I don't think you can necessarily learn these things to a large degree. If you're not charismatic, you can force it, and you could probably be coached on a lot of this stuff. But in general, it comes out in your nature, and you reflexively go back to who you are in a lot of cases. So if I'm a snarky misanthrope, then I'm going to hate people no matter what. And you can see it with a lot of psychopathic politicians like Mitt Romney, that it's borne out in just how they treat people in general. You can only put up a front for so long, this pretense on how you should act rather than who you actually are. If you're a psycho private equity partner, then that's probably going to carry through at some point to your entire being, your aura. And we, as humans, are quite intuitive on this. Women and particularly babies and children are really good at this, very intuitive. Men, a little bit, particularly the smarter men, who try and trick themselves into certain things like, oh, I need to know his policy positions on this before I can consider voting for him. And you can see that down here a little bit in the IQ bell curve thing. But the caveman, grug need strong leader. It's just true. Most of the good politicians can appeal to this low level, just saying like, I don't need to offer good policy positions because none of these retards will read it and they don't care. They want someone to represent who they are and they want to be strong, important men. So they elect a strong, important man and they can go to bat for me like a sports team, like a war, like whatever it was that you can tribalistic politics understand as a human instinct. So that's how we could land on that. And hopefully that's giving you a bit of an idea here. I could obviously walk you through, say something like a Markov chain on what events are required to put us into which positions, and if it's JD Vance who is running up against Gavin Newsom, and then the Markov chain would look like this, and then the probabilities of certain outcomes, particularly presidential ones, but I won't do that and bore you. What I'll hopefully try and end on the denouement around this is just to suggest the theoretical understanding that JD Vance is very defeatable. Not because JD himself is not necessarily reflective of what we want in a politician. I'm not American, so I don't get to vote, but in general, the West is streamlined behind the Americans in the way that they lead us. So in all of our self-interests, it will still reflect what we have as a leader, the Americans. And so JD Vance, with his particular style and platform, is very beatable, and it's difficult for me to see him as an ironclad case until he is able to come to there's basically a fork in the road here for JD, where he needs to outshine Donald Trump in a way that doesn't tarnish Donald Trump. This is very difficult to do. When you're someone's protege, it's only possible to excel and exceed them if it looks like a general transition through them as they're pushing you out to sea in that very patriarchal instinct way of saying, look, I now prove this person, they're going to take my torch and bear it further into wherever. And so it's going to be very difficult for JD to do that because he's not a Trump-style politician. He can't just be the braggadocio bravura of Trump and go out and do those things. He is a bit more of a sensitive young man, millennial, and the way that he was brought up and his background being a Marine and then being in a law school, VC, and all of these things start to culminate in someone who's very different. So it's not enough that he looks and sounds like a presidential candidate. This is very superficial stuff. This is the stuff that a political consultant will go out and be paid $1,000 an hour for. It's all nonsense. It's just telling people things that they think they need to hear. This is the stuff that actually gets politicians elected. It's how do I harness the anima of the political office in a way that allows me to subsume it into me. So Donald Trump's life breath basically needs to be breathed in by me, and now I need to embody and imbue it in a way that I'm distinct from him, but it's clearly more powerful and the right choice. Me 2028 looks like a better and improved young, vigorous version of what Donald would have picked if he was able to pick, because we're going to think that Donald Trump will probably die somewhere between 2028 and 2030. So maybe his legacy carries JD to a first term win, much like George Bush from Reagan. But unfortunately for JD is that Donald has he's very distinct in his style, and it has completely polarized the Republican Party such that you don't have a template anymore. So previously and historically, the Democrats have had a template. You can run through it as long as your candidature fit the mold, mostly 80% wise. Then you were able to run under that banner, and they promoted you for that reason. As long as you've scratched enough backs and you were doing the political currying of favors and toadying in the right ways, pork barreling, all of these machinations, you were getting the right donors from the right billionaire class, then you'll be the candidate. Donald Trump has transcended this and smashed it to a large degree for the Republicans. So it's not very clear how they'll coalesce behind someone. And the coagulation of certain policy is now in the air. Donald Trump is pro-abortion, and historically Republicans have been anti-abortion. So clearly it's not a very important policy. They'll harp on online or whatever on Fox News about this crap. It's not important. Let me tell you right now. Abortion is not important. None of these policy positions are very important unless it's in contrast to the other team. So if we're both pro-abortion, then I can become a ground gaining candidate if I take the opposite position, and there's enough of the, as I said before, the reflective permutations of that. So you can have a matching polity position which actually extends my vote beyond what yours would be if I maintain the same position. This is why uniparty politics centers around certain few topics, is because it allows for very similar positions on the main stage, then have the fringe positions to see, oh look, I'll win on guns and you'll win on trannies, and then we'll see how many votes sort out of that. Whereas Trump just takes a Trump position and people vote for Trump. This is how Caesars are born, and I've gone over this at length already in separate videos. But the way that JD Vance now needs to approach it cannot be in the mold of a Republican like John McCain or Sarah Palin or Paul Ryan or Mitt Romney. It will not win him proper power. He might be a transition president, do nothing, be no one, and fade into obscurity thereafter. So it is beholden to him. It behooves him, really, to go out and actually define himself as a politician to win that. This is why his probability is not very high at becoming the 2028 president. If I were JD, then I would go out there and I'd be as bombastic as possible in a way that's dissimilar to Trump, but defining myself just as much as the go-getter. And I would still have to appeal to the laggard end of the boomer tail, which is the ones who haven't died yet, because they still represent quite a large populace in terms of the voting populace. But I would start to then appeal to the Gen Z and millennials, because I understand that the transition of power can be impermanent in a way that there isn't a necessitation around 2 terms only. It isn't that I'll win 1 term, I'll win my 2nd term, vacate office, next one in. That isn't the necessary function of being a president anymore. I know it's been amended to be the case, but amendments can be voided. There's an amendment to an amendment. It's can be stricken from the record. It's not like it's permanent just because we've amended it once, it's there forever. So I would say, like, if you want someone who's strong enough to lead that through, then it has to be someone who's going to step on the previous candidate, and that would be Donald Trump. So you almost need to defeat, and this is in maybe a Buildings Roman, but in the hero saga, you have the sage role model who teaches you all of these things. I think Mr. Miyagi in The Karate Kid, or Gandalf in Lord of the Rings, he'll take the main character through the journey to a certain degree, and then he'll die or something. He'll be disappearing for whatever reason after that point, and then the protagonist must continue on with their own wherewithal. And so if you've got enough gumption as a candidate, then you'll be able to surpass the hopes and dreams of your patriarch or your mentor in that way. But it is the case that JD doesn't quite come across as having that so much right now. He is young-ish, being 40 or 42 or something like that. So he has a development opportunity here. You can't be fat, so he'll need to do something about that. He looks a bit spiritually fat, and so he has to be very clear on the way that he comes across. Donald Trump is also very fat, but the way he holds his weight is not this like portly fatso lard ass, even though he's overweight for his stature, he still comes across as being the alpha dog with just a bit more weight and power behind him in the way that he carries himself. JD is a little bit more plump. He's a little bit more neo-fat. You know how young fat people have this tendency to be a bit pudgy and a bit soft rather than being like bulbous and hard fat. It's hard to say, but you know what I'm talking about when I'm describing this. So rather than being some like rotund, portly fellow, which is what he comes across, which can only be interpreted as jolly, and we don't want a jolly leader. We want someone who's very stern and serious and powerful. Then he'll need to hit the gym, hop on a course of steroids, something around transforming the way he looks into being a more determined man. Now, the second problem I see with JD, and this has turned a little bit into a JD critique, and I think that's fair because if he's the presumptive nominee for the next election, he needs to have these things squared away, is that he has an Indian family. This, in an environment, an atmosphere of anti-immigration, will bite him in the ass. There is no way around this horrendous choice of his. And his personal life is probably obviously not a product of what he thought he was going to be able to do. If you came from where he came from, it's unlikely he ever thought he was going to be president. So by the time you've met the love of your life, which is some random Brahmin Indian chick who's interested in you for whatever reason, and you're interested in her because she's the first educated woman who's ever shown interest in you, then you've made a poor choice. And I can say that with both foresight and hindsight, that as a Gothic Faustian man, marrying an Indian is just an impossibility for me to understand, well, the logic behind it, but also the detriment to your course, your journey, your destiny, because you've harpooned yourself. It's a self-inflicted gunshot wound to your like cranium here. And rather than dying, you've just started to like hobble to the next post. Now, the way to overcome this is obviously divorcing her and finding an actual Faustian wife. In lieu of that, because obviously that is a death knell for some people in terms of his ability to commit. Donald Trump is a serial marrier, husband. He's had 2-3 ex-wives. So you can see that it's not a problem for the American populace for someone to be divorced as a president. Although historically it seems like there's been a legacy of very trusting and harmonious, well-natured husbands as presidents. It's just not the case that it's necessary. After Bill Clinton was getting blowies in the Oval Office, what's the need for a pretense on this? We say, like, look, presidents have always been, if not lecherous, then at least lascivious. So they have always had flaws, character flaws in particular, whether it's drugs, drinking, sex, swearing, violence, whatever it is, that we like that in a president. This is very becoming. So if JD, for instance, was able to have a mistress who was like some Aryan goddess, that would be something that he would be able to pivot to, that would embolden and strengthen him. You would think, no, that can't be the case. Trust me on this. If it came out that JD had this like 5'11" blonde bombshell as a mistress who was maybe even a bimbo, like total dipshit, I guarantee you that gets him more votes across the spectrum. I guarantee it. Keeping the solemnity here with your Indian wife and looking very miserable next to you all the time with your ugly kids does not help. No one likes this. No one can feel themselves in you. No one is vicariously living through your choices here because it's just obscene. It's something that's unconscionable. No one understands why you've made these decisions, JD. So you can make them revocable. You can change these perceptions about yourself, but it requires drastic actions. It makes you more human to define yourself by, say, something outrageous and almost a mistake than it does to be a normie in a normie sphere doing the normal things. We don't want presidents who are normies because presidents shouldn't be normies. They should be leaders who define the office. Caesars in particular are like that. They go into the stage of power and define it under their own guise, in their own essence. So this is what we're looking for in someone, and JD just doesn't quite fit that mold just now. He's a very likable person, and that's fine, but it's not defining him as the president in perpetuity in something as an empire. And he'll say, no, I don't want that position. I have respect for the office. Once again, this is not the type of rhetoric you want to hear. You want the guy like Trump who says, yeah, maybe I'll run again in 4 years, even though he knows it's against the policy against legislation. Like, it's illegal to do it. It's like, yeah, but I can say it. People like that. That's what people respond to. They don't like someone who's very square on these things and goes, no, that's not something that I would ever consider. They like that Trump didn't feel as if the 2020 election was fair. It probably wasn't fair. It probably was rigged. They've been rigged for 300 years. It doesn't make sense for it to also have been rigged this time. Why break with tradition of 250 years of tradition of not rigging elections? I mean, of course they're rigged. But in the general case, it's like, well, I still will go out there and say this is a false election. This was a pseudo election. This is a farce. And I'll prove it by running again and winning. And he did. And this is what the triumphant return of Trump was about. This is how it's represented. Once again, this is a journey. This is like a narrative that we're creating around this. And the strength of character of Trump shows you this. So, in the very, very verbose way of me outlining a video and many, many tangents and asides, we go into the understanding then that we can come to an agreement on what is the likely outcome of the 2028 election. Using a character sheet of who the candidates are, I will be able to tell you the likely probabilities of them winning because of how they are represented in the polity versus the political space. And the candidate to polity permutation shows you that the coefficients will lead to this level of voting, basically. Democracy is flawed in this way. We can predict it. So the probability of certain people winning is very clear. It's very easy to understand. What we want to see is someone who defies this logic and says, democracy is done. We're moving on to the next system. It's an eternal reign of Caesars. And this is where it starts with me. And I refuse to leave the office until someone bests me and can replace me in that office.